The mirror effect. Human beings are wired to like people who are similar to them. This is called the mirror effect, and it runs deeper than most people realize. When someone mirrors your behavior, your speech patterns, or even your sitting position, your brain interprets this as a sign that this person understands you. The mirror effect works because of something called the similarity attraction principle. Your brain constantly scans for signs of whether someone is part of your tribe or not. When someone acts like you, talks like you, or shares your opinions, your unconscious mind marks them as safe and trustworthy. This happens automatically. You cannot turn it off. When someone leans forward while you lean forward, or speaks at the same pace you do, your nervous system relaxes. You feel more comfortable. You start to trust them more, even though nothing about their character has actually been revealed. The mirror effect extends beyond just physical movements. When someone uses the same words you use, agrees with your viewpoints, or shares similar experiences, the same psychological mechanism kicks in. Your brain thinks, this person is like me, therefore, they must be good. Here's what makes this particularly powerful. The person doing the mirroring doesn't need to actually share your beliefs or values. They just need to reflect them back to you convincingly. A skilled manipulator can study your behavior for just a few minutes and start mirroring your body language, your speaking style, and your expressed opinions. The mirror effect also works in reverse. When someone consistently does the opposite of what you do, or disagrees with everything you say, your brain marks them as different and potentially threatening. This is why people who are naturally contrarian often struggle to build rapport, even when their intentions are good. Sales professionals have used this technique for decades. They match their customers' energy level, speaking speed, and even breathing patterns. Politicians do it too, adjusting their accent and vocabulary depending on their audience. The reason it works is that it bypasses your conscious analytical mind and speaks directly to your emotional brain. The mirror effect is so strong that it can override logical thinking. You might find yourself agreeing with someone or feeling positive about them, even when their actual arguments don't make much sense. Your brain is responding to the feeling of similarity rather than the content of what they're saying. Understanding this effect can help you recognize when it's being used on you. Pay attention to how you feel around certain people. Are you feeling unusually comfortable or trusting? Look at their behavior. Are they matching your movements, your tone, or your opinions a little too perfectly? The foot in the door technique. People have a deep psychological need to be consistent with their previous actions and commitments. This need for consistency is so strong that it can be used to manipulate behavior in predictable ways. The foot in the door technique exploits this need by starting with a small request and gradually building up to larger ones. The technique works because of something called commitment escalation. Once you agree to do something small, your brain adjusts your self-image to match that action. If you agreed to help someone with a minor favor, you now see yourself as the kind of person who helps that particular person. When they come back with a bigger request, saying no would create psychological discomfort because it contradicts this new self-image. This psychological discomfort is called cognitive dissonance. Your brain desperately wants to avoid contradicting itself. So when faced with a choice between helping again or admitting that your self-image was wrong, most people choose to help again. The foot in the door technique is incredibly effective because each small compliance makes the next request seem more reasonable. The person isn't asking you to jump from 0 to 100. They're asking you to go from 10 to 20, then from 20 to 30. Each step feels manageable, even though the final destination might be somewhere you would never have agreed to go initially. Charities understand this psychology well. They don't start by asking for large donations. They might begin by asking you to sign a petition, then request a small donation, then invite you to volunteer for an hour, then ask for a larger donation. Each step builds on the previous commitment. The technique works even when there's a time gap between requests. Once you've established yourself as someone who complies with this person's requests, that identity can remain dormant for weeks or months before being activated again. What makes this technique particularly insidious is that the person being manipulated often feels like they're making free choices. They don't realize that their decision-making is being guided by their need to maintain consistency with previous decisions. They believe they're helping because they want to, not because they're psychologically trapped by their earlier commitments. The foot in the door technique also works because of the escalation of commitment principle. Once you've invested time, energy, or resources into something, you become more likely to continue investing, even when it's no longer rational to do so. Each small compliance increases your psychological investment in the relationship or cause. Breaking free from this technique requires recognizing when it's happening. Ask yourself, would I agree to this request if it was the first thing this person had ever asked me? If the answer is no, you might be caught in a foot in the door sequence. The door in the face technique. While the foot in the door technique starts small and builds up, the door in the face technique does the opposite. It starts with an unreasonably large request that almost everyone will refuse, then follows up with a smaller, more reasonable request. The smaller request is actually what the person wanted all along. This technique exploits several psychological principles simultaneously. First, there's the contrast effect. After being asked for something huge, a moderate request seems small by comparison. Your brain doesn't evaluate the second request on its own merits. Instead, it compares it to the first request, making it appear much more reasonable than it actually is. The technique also triggers reciprocal concessions. When someone makes a large request and you refuse, they appear to compromise by making a smaller request. Your brain interprets this as them meeting you halfway, even though they never intended for you to accept the first request. You feel obligated to compromise in return by accepting the second request. There's also a guilt component. When you refuse the first request, you might feel slightly bad about not helping. The second request gives you an opportunity to alleviate this guilt by being helpful, just not as helpful as originally asked. The door in the face technique is effective because it creates the illusion of negotiation. You feel like you've won something by getting them to lower their request. In reality, you've been guided toward exactly what they wanted from the beginning. This technique is commonly used in sales and negotiations. A car salesperson might start by showing you an expensive model with all the premium features, then guide you toward a mid-range model that seems reasonable by comparison. The mid-range model was their target all along, but it seems like a good deal because of the contrast with the expensive model. The door in the face technique works even when people are aware that they're being manipulated, which makes it particularly powerful. Your rational mind might recognize what's happening, but your emotional brain still responds to the contrast and the apparent concession. The technique fails when the initial request is so outrageous that it seems ridiculous or insincere. There's a sweet spot where the first request is large enough to create contrast, but believable enough that the person doesn't dismiss the entire interaction. Time pressure enhances the effectiveness of this technique. When people feel rushed to make a decision, they're more likely to rely on mental shortcuts like contrast rather than carefully evaluating each option. Understanding this technique can help you make better decisions. When someone makes a large request, followed by a smaller one, take time to evaluate the smaller request independently. Ask yourself, is this something I would want to do if it was the only request being made? The Zeigarnik Effect. Your brain has a built-in obsession with unfinished business. This psychological quirk is called the Zeigarnik Effect, named after the psychologist who first studied it systematically. Incomplete tasks create a state of psychological tension that your mind constantly tries to resolve. This effect occurs because your brain treats unfinished tasks as active mental files that remain open in your background processing. These mental files consume attention and energy even when you're not consciously thinking about them. Your mind keeps returning to incomplete tasks, trying to figure out how to finish them or resolve them. The Zeigarnik Effect explains why you can remember interrupted conversations better than completed ones, and why cliffhangers in television shows are so effective at bringing viewers back. Your brain doesn't like loose ends. It wants closure, completion, and resolution. Manipulative people exploit this effect by creating artificial incompleteness. They start conversations but don't finish them. They hint at important information but don't reveal it. They begin projects or commitments but leave crucial elements unresolved. This creates mental tension that keeps you thinking about them and the situation. The effect is particularly strong when the incomplete task is personally meaningful or when you feel partially responsible for its completion. If someone starts to tell you something important but gets interrupted, you'll keep thinking about what they were going to say. If someone asks for your help with something but doesn't specify exactly what they need, your brain will keep trying to solve that puzzle. Social media platforms deliberately use the Zeigarnik Effect to increase engagement. Notifications, partial messages, and endless scrolling feeds all create states of incompleteness that keep users mentally engaged with the platform even when they're not actively using it. The effect also works in relationships. When someone gives you partial attention, incomplete information, or inconsistent communication, it creates psychological tension that can actually increase your interest in them. Your brain interprets the incompleteness as a puzzle to solve rather than a sign of disinterest. Breaking free from the Zeigarnik Effect requires conscious effort to create closure. When you notice your mind obsessing over something incomplete, you can either take action to complete it or consciously decide to let it go. Writing down unfinished tasks or unresolved situations can help move them from active mental processing to external storage. The Zeigarnik Effect becomes problematic when it's used to keep you mentally trapped in situations that aren't healthy or productive. Recognizing when incompleteness is being used to manipulate your attention can help you regain control over your mental energy. Guilt tripping. Guilt is one of the most powerful emotional motivators humans experience. It evolved as a social emotion to help maintain relationships and group cohesion. When you feel guilty, your brain is telling you that you've violated your own moral standards or harmed someone you care about. Guilt tripping exploits this natural emotional response for manipulative purposes. A guilt trip works by making you feel responsible for someone else's negative emotions or circumstances. The person doing the guilt tripping presents themselves as a victim of your actions, choices, or lack of action. They don't directly ask for what they want. Instead, they make you feel bad enough that you offer it voluntarily. Guilt tripping is effective because it bypasses rational decision-making. When you feel guilty, your brain's priority becomes alleviating that uncomfortable emotion as quickly as possible. This often means doing whatever the other person wants, even if it's not in your best interest. The technique works by manipulating your sense of moral responsibility. Humans have evolved to feel responsible not just for their direct actions, but also for their failures to act. A skilled guilt tripper will frame your normal boundaries, preferences, or limitations as harmful to them. Guilt trips often include exaggerated emotional displays, historical grievances, or comparisons to what others have done. The goal is to make you feel that your behavior is unusually selfish or hurtful. The guilt tripper positions themselves as long-suffering, and you as unnecessarily cruel or indifferent. One particularly effective form of guilt tripping involves self-sacrifice narratives. The person emphasizes everything they've done for you or others, creating an implied debt that you need to repay. They might also threaten self-harm or describe how your choices are ruining their life. Guilt tripping often targets your core values and identities. If you see yourself as a caring person, the guilt tripper will suggest that your behavior proves you don't actually care. If you value fairness, they'll frame the situation as you being unfair to them. The technique is particularly effective on people who are naturally empathetic or who have been raised to prioritize others' needs over their own. These individuals are more susceptible to feeling responsible for other people's emotional states. Chronic exposure to guilt tripping can be psychologically damaging. It can lead to anxiety, depression, and a distorted sense of personal responsibility. People who are frequently guilt-tripped often lose touch with their own needs and preferences. Recognizing guilt tripping requires paying attention to how you feel during and after interactions. If you consistently feel guilty, ashamed, or responsible for someone else's problems after talking with them, you might be experiencing manipulation. Healthy relationships involve mutual respect for boundaries and don't require you to feel bad about reasonable choices. Triangulation. Triangulation is a manipulation technique that involves bringing a third party into a two-person conflict or relationship. Instead of addressing issues directly with you, the manipulator uses other people to communicate messages, apply pressure, or validate their position. This creates confusion and emotional instability, while giving the manipulator more control over the situation. The technique works because it exploits your natural concern about what others think of you. When someone suggests that a third party agrees with them or disapproves of your behavior, it adds weight to their argument. You're no longer just dealing with one person's opinion. You're dealing with what feels like a group consensus. Triangulation often involves the manipulator claiming to speak for others. They might say that your mutual friends are worried about you, that your family members have expressed concerns, or that everyone thinks you're being unreasonable. These claims may be exaggerated or completely false, but they create social pressure. Another form of triangulation involves the manipulator sharing private information about your relationship with third parties, then using their reactions to support their position. They might tell others about your conflicts in a way that makes you look bad, then report back that these people agree with their perspective. Triangulation can also involve creating competition for the manipulator's attention or approval. They might compare you unfavorably to others, suggest that other people treat them better, or threaten to replace you with someone else. This creates insecurity and motivates you to try harder to please them. The technique is particularly effective because it prevents direct, honest communication. Instead of working through issues together, you're left wondering who said what to whom and trying to manage multiple relationships simultaneously. This confusion serves the manipulator's interests by keeping you off balance. Triangulation often involves flying monkeys, people who unknowingly assist the manipulator by carrying messages or applying pressure. These individuals usually believe they're helping resolve a conflict, but they're actually being used as tools of manipulation. The emotional impact of triangulation includes increased anxiety, self-doubt, and social isolation. You might start questioning your own perceptions and wondering if everyone really is against you. The constant uncertainty about who knows what can be exhausting and destabilizing. Breaking free from triangulation requires establishing direct communication and boundaries. Refuse to accept second-hand information about what others supposedly think. Ask to speak directly with anyone who allegedly has concerns. Don't allow others to use third parties as intermediaries for important conversations. Recognizing triangulation involves paying attention to communication patterns. If someone frequently mentions what others think instead of expressing their own views, or if they seem to know suspiciously detailed information about other people's opinions of you, triangulation might be occurring. The silent treatment. The silent treatment is a form of emotional punishment that involves withdrawing communication and attention as a way to control behavior. It exploits humans' fundamental need for social connection and communication. When someone important to you stops talking to you or acknowledging your existence, it creates significant psychological distress. This technique works because humans are social creatures who depend on relationships for emotional well-being. Being ignored or excluded triggers the same pain pathways in your brain that physical injury does. Your mind interprets social rejection as a threat to survival, which is why the silent treatment feels so devastating. The silent treatment serves multiple manipulative purposes. First, it punishes you for whatever behavior the other person didn't like, creating negative associations with that behavior. Second, it trains you to avoid actions that might result in being ignored again. Third, it puts the other person in a position of power where they control when normal communication resumes. The technique is particularly cruel because it provides no clear path to resolution. Unlike direct conflict, where you can argue your position or apologize, the silent treatment offers no opportunity for dialogue. You're left guessing what you did wrong and how to fix it. Silent treatment often escalates conflicts rather than resolving them. The person being ignored becomes increasingly desperate to restore communication, sometimes agreeing to unreasonable demands or taking excessive responsibility for problems that weren't entirely their fault. The psychological impact includes anxiety, depression, self-doubt, and obsessive thinking about the relationship. You might find yourself analyzing every past interaction, trying to figure out what you did wrong. This mental preoccupation serves the manipulator's interests by keeping you focused on them and the relationship. The silent treatment differs from healthy space-taking, where someone temporarily withdraws to process emotions or think through problems. Healthy space-taking involves communication about the need for time and usually includes a timeline for resuming contact. The silent treatment involves no such communication and no clear endpoint. People who use the silent treatment often do so because they learned it in childhood or because they lack skills for healthy conflict resolution. However, the impact on the recipient is harmful regardless of the motivation behind it. Breaking free from the silent treatment requires refusing to chase the other person or drastically change your behavior to win back their attention. Set a reasonable timeline for how long you're willing to wait for communication to resume, and stick to it. The key to recognizing when silence is being used manipulatively is to look at the pattern and context. Occasional need for space is normal. Regularly withdrawing communication as punishment or to control behavior is manipulation. The illusory truth effect. Your brain has a dangerous shortcut for determining whether information is true: familiarity. The more often you hear something, the more likely you are to believe it, regardless of whether it's actually accurate. This cognitive bias is called the illusory truth effect, and it can be exploited to make false information seem credible. The effect occurs because your brain confuses familiarity with truth. When you encounter information multiple times, it becomes easier to process and feels more fluent. Your mind interprets this fluency as a sign that the information is correct. This happens automatically and unconsciously, even when you know better intellectually. Repetition makes false information feel true even when you initially rejected it as false. Each time you encounter the same claim, it becomes slightly more believable. This is why propaganda techniques rely heavily on repetition. The goal isn't to convince you immediately, but to gradually wear down your skepticism through repeated exposure. The illusory truth effect is particularly powerful when the false information is mixed with true information. Your brain's truth detection system becomes confused and starts treating everything from that source as potentially credible. This is why effective propaganda includes verifiable facts alongside false claims. Social media amplifies the illusory truth effect by creating echo chambers where the same information circulates repeatedly among people who already agree with each other. Each share, like, or comment increases the apparent credibility of the information, even when no new evidence is presented. The effect works even when people are warned about it, or when they're specifically told that some of the information they're hearing is false. Your conscious analytical mind might remain skeptical, but your unconscious pattern recognition system continues to register repeated claims as more credible. Manipulative individuals exploit this effect by consistently repeating their version of events, their interpretations, or their claims about other people. They might tell the same story multiple times with slight variations, each repetition making their version seem more factual. The illusory truth effect also applies to self-statements. When you repeatedly tell yourself something, even something negative or false, you become more likely to believe it. This is how negative self-talk can become entrenched, and how positive affirmations can gradually shift self-perception. Protecting yourself from the illusory truth effect requires conscious effort to evaluate information based on evidence rather than familiarity. When you notice yourself becoming more convinced of something primarily because you've heard it multiple times, take a step back and examine the actual evidence. The key is to distinguish between information that's familiar and information that's well supported. Just because something feels true doesn't mean it is true. Developing better source evaluation skills and actively seeking diverse perspectives can help counteract this powerful cognitive bias. Gaslighting. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation, where someone systematically makes you question your own memory, perception, and sanity. The term comes from a 1944 movie where a husband deliberately dims the gas lights in their home while denying that the lights are changing, causing his wife to doubt her own senses. The technique works by creating a consistent pattern of denial, contradiction, and reality distortion. The gaslighter contradicts your memories of events, denies saying things they clearly said, and insists that situations happen differently than you remember. Over time, this systematic contradiction erodes your confidence in your own perceptions. Gaslighting is particularly effective because it targets your basic sense of reality. Humans rely on their ability to accurately perceive and remember events in order to function in the world. When someone consistently challenges these fundamental capacities, it creates profound psychological distress and dependency. The process typically follows a pattern. First, the gaslighter does or says something harmful. When you respond or confront them, they deny it happened or claim you misunderstood. They might accuse you of being too sensitive, crazy, or having a bad memory. They often flip the situation to make themselves the victim. Gaslighting often involves strategic kindness mixed with cruelty. The gaslighter might be loving and supportive sometimes, then cruel and dismissive other times. This inconsistency keeps you off balance and makes you doubt whether the negative incidents really happened the way you remember. Effective gaslighting also involves isolating you from outside perspectives that might validate your experiences. The gaslighter might discourage you from talking to friends or family about relationship problems, or they might present alternative versions of events to mutual acquaintances. The psychological impact of gaslighting includes anxiety, depression, confusion, and a gradual loss of self-trust. Victims often become hypervigilant about their own behavior and constantly second-guess their reactions to situations. They might start keeping detailed records of conversations to verify their own memories. Gaslighting differs from normal disagreements about facts or interpretations. In healthy relationships, people can have different perspectives on events while still respecting each other's basic competence and honesty. Gaslighting involves a systematic pattern of making the other person feel incompetent or unreliable. Breaking free from gaslighting requires rebuilding trust in your own perceptions and seeking outside validation for your experiences. Keeping a private journal of events can help you maintain a record of what actually happened. Talking to trusted friends or professionals can provide reality checks. The key to recognizing gaslighting is paying attention to how you feel about your own judgment and memory after interactions with certain people. If you consistently leave conversations feeling confused about what happened or doubting your own recollections, gaslighting might be occurring. Time pressure. Time pressure is a manipulation technique that forces quick decisions by creating artificial urgency. When people feel rushed, they rely more on emotional reactions and mental shortcuts rather than careful analysis. This makes them more susceptible to manipulation and more likely to make decisions they might later regret. The technique works because your brain has two different decision-making systems. The first system is fast, emotional, and intuitive. The second system is slower, analytical, and logical. Time pressure activates the first system while preventing the second system from fully engaging. This leads to decisions based on emotion rather than careful consideration. Artificial urgency can be created in many ways. Someone might claim that an opportunity is only available for a limited time, that other people are waiting for your decision, or that delaying will result in negative consequences. These claims may be partially true, completely false, or deliberately exaggerated. Time pressure is particularly effective when combined with other manipulation techniques. For instance, someone might use the door-in-the-face technique to present an unreasonable request, then add time pressure by claiming you need to decide immediately. The combination makes it more likely that you'll accept their fallback position without proper consideration. The technique exploits your fear of missing out and your desire to avoid regret. When you believe that delaying a decision might cause you to lose an opportunity, you become more willing to take risks or accept unfavorable terms. Your brain prioritizes avoiding the regret of missing out over the risk of making a bad decision. Sales environments frequently use time pressure through limited time offers, countdown timers, and claims about inventory levels. The goal is to prevent you from comparison shopping, researching alternatives, or simply sleeping on the decision. Time pressure also works in personal relationships. Someone might demand immediate answers to important questions, claim they can't wait for you to think things through, or threaten consequences if you don't decide quickly. This pressure can lead to commitments you're not ready to make. The psychological impact of chronic time pressure includes stress, anxiety, and decision fatigue. When you're constantly forced to make quick choices, your decision-making quality degrades over time. You might start avoiding decisions entirely or become paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes. Protecting yourself from time pressure manipulation requires recognizing when urgency is artificial and giving yourself permission to slow down the decision-making process. Legitimate urgent situations are actually quite rare. Most important decisions can wait at least a few hours or days. The key is to distinguish between real deadlines and manufactured urgency. Ask yourself, what would actually happen if I took more time to think about this? Often, the consequences of delaying are much less severe than the person creating pressure wants you to believe. Anchoring bias. Your brain has a peculiar quirk when processing numerical information. The first number you hear heavily influences all subsequent judgments, even when that first number is completely irrelevant. This cognitive bias is called anchoring, and it can be exploited to manipulate your decisions about everything from prices to personal choices. Anchoring occurs because your brain uses the first piece of information as a reference point for making comparisons. Even when you know the initial number is meaningless, it still affects your thinking. Your brain treats it as a starting point and then adjusts from there, but the adjustment is usually insufficient. The effect is remarkably robust. Studies have shown that even random numbers can serve as anchors. When people are shown their social security number before making a pricing decision, those with higher social security numbers tend to bid more money. This happens despite the obvious irrelevance of social security numbers to pricing. Manipulative people exploit anchoring by strategically introducing high numbers early in negotiations or conversations. A real estate agent might mention expensive properties before showing you more moderately priced ones. A contractor might quote an inflated price knowing you'll negotiate down, but the final price will still be higher than if they had started with a reasonable estimate. Anchoring also works with non-numerical information. If someone describes a person as intelligent before mentioning their flaws, you're more likely to interpret those flaws charitably. If they mention the flaws first, you're more likely to view the person negatively overall. The order of information creates an anchor that influences all subsequent processing. The technique is particularly effective in situations where you don't have strong prior knowledge or experience. When you're uncertain about what's normal or reasonable, you rely more heavily on whatever reference point is available. This is why anchoring works so well with complex decisions or unfamiliar situations. Anchoring bias affects not just your evaluation of external options, but also your self-assessment. If someone mentions high standards or exceptional performance before asking you to evaluate yourself, you might rate yourself lower than you would otherwise. The anchor changes your internal comparison standards. The effect persists even when people are warned about anchoring bias or specifically told to ignore the initial number. Your conscious mind might recognize the manipulation, but your unconscious processing system continues to be influenced by the anchor. Breaking free from anchoring bias requires conscious effort to establish independent reference points. Before making important decisions, research typical ranges or ask for multiple estimates. Try to gather information from sources that haven't been influenced by the same anchor. The key to recognizing anchoring manipulation is paying attention to the first numbers or pieces of information presented in any decision-making context. Ask yourself, is this person giving me a reference point that serves their interests rather than helping me make a good decision? False scarcity. Scarcity triggers powerful psychological responses because throughout human evolution, resources were often genuinely limited. When something appears scarce, your brain activates urgency mechanisms designed to help you compete for limited resources. False scarcity exploits these ancient survival instincts for manipulative purposes. The technique works by creating the impression that something valuable is in short supply or will soon become unavailable. This perceived scarcity increases the item's apparent value and motivates quick action. Your brain interprets scarcity as a signal that something must be desirable, otherwise other people wouldn't be competing for it. False scarcity can involve claims about limited quantities, time restrictions, or exclusive access. Someone might tell you that only a few spots remain available, that an offer expires soon, or that most people aren't eligible for this opportunity. These claims create artificial pressure to act quickly before the opportunity disappears. The psychological impact of scarcity includes increased arousal, narrowed attention, and reduced deliberation. When you believe something is scarce, your brain shifts into acquisition mode. You focus intensely on obtaining the scarce resource and pay less attention to whether you actually need it or whether it's worth the cost. Scarcity also triggers social proof mechanisms. If something is scarce because other people are competing for it, your brain assumes those people must know something you don't. The apparent demand from others serves as evidence that the item is valuable and worth pursuing. False scarcity is particularly effective when combined with other manipulation techniques. For instance, someone might use anchoring bias to establish a high reference price, then create false scarcity to pressure you into buying before you can comparison shop or negotiate. The technique exploits your fear of regret and loss aversion. You become more focused on avoiding the regret of missing out than on carefully evaluating whether the opportunity is actually good for you. This emotional state makes you more willing to take risks or make compromises. Digital environments amplify false scarcity through countdown timers, inventory counters, and notifications about other people's activity. These visual cues create constant reminders about scarcity and maintain psychological pressure, even when you're trying to think rationally about the decision. Breaking free from false scarcity manipulation requires slowing down and questioning the scarcity claims. Ask yourself, how do I know this is actually scarce? What would happen if I missed this particular opportunity? Are there similar alternatives available? The key to recognizing false scarcity is examining the source and motivation behind scarcity claims. Someone who benefits from your quick decision is more likely to exaggerate or fabricate scarcity. Take time to verify scarcity claims through independent sources before making important decisions. Framing manipulation. The way information is presented has enormous influence on how you interpret and respond to it, even when the underlying facts remain the same. This is called framing, and it can be used to manipulate your decisions by highlighting certain aspects of a situation while downplaying others. Framing works because your brain doesn't process information in a vacuum. It interprets new information within whatever context is provided. The frame acts like a lens that determines which aspects of a situation you pay attention to and how you evaluate them emotionally. The same factual information can be framed positively or negatively to create completely different impressions. A medical treatment could be described as having a 90% success rate or a 10% failure rate. These statements contain identical information, but they create different emotional responses and different likelihood of acceptance. Manipulative framing often involves presenting limited options to make one choice seem obviously superior. Instead of presenting all available alternatives, the manipulator frames the decision as a choice between their preferred option and one or two less attractive alternatives. This makes their preference seem reasonable by comparison. Temporal framing manipulates your perception of time to influence decisions. Someone might emphasize short-term benefits while downplaying long-term costs, or vice versa. They might frame a decision as urgent when it's actually routine, or as routine when it actually has significant long-term implications. Emotional framing uses charged language and vivid imagery to trigger specific emotional responses. The same policy proposal might be framed as protecting families or restricting freedom, depending on the desired emotional response. These emotional reactions then influence how you evaluate the actual policy details. Framing also works through selective emphasis and omission. A manipulator might present accurate information, but emphasize the aspects that support their position while minimizing or omitting information that contradicts it. This creates a distorted picture without technically lying. The context in which information is presented also serves as a frame. Information presented in a medical setting feels more credible than the same information presented in a sales context. Information from someone wearing a uniform carries different weight than identical information from someone in casual clothes. Breaking free from framing manipulation requires conscious effort to reframe information in multiple ways. Ask yourself, how would this situation look if it were presented differently? What information might be missing? What would someone with opposing interests emphasize about this same situation? The key to recognizing framing manipulation is paying attention to the emotional responses triggered by how information is presented. If you notice strong positive or negative reactions to information, examine whether those reactions are based on the facts themselves or on how the facts are being presented. Social proof exploitation. Humans are fundamentally social creatures who look to others for guidance about appropriate behavior. This tendency to follow the crowd served our ancestors well when group cohesion meant survival. Today, this same instinct can be exploited through social proof manipulation, where evidence of other people's behavior is used to influence your decisions. Social proof works because your brain uses other people's actions as a shortcut for determining what's normal, safe, or desirable. When you see that many people are doing something, your unconscious mind assumes they must know something you don't. This assumption happens automatically, before your conscious analytical mind has a chance to evaluate whether following the crowd actually makes sense. The power of social proof increases dramatically when you identify with the people whose behavior you're observing. You're more likely to be influenced by people who seem similar to you in age, background, values, or circumstances. Manipulators exploit this by carefully selecting which examples of social proof to present, showing you people who match your demographic or identity. False social proof involves creating artificial evidence of popularity or acceptance. This might include fake testimonials, inflated user numbers, or staged demonstrations of enthusiasm. The goal is to trigger your instinct to follow the crowd, even when the crowd doesn't actually exist or isn't as large as it appears. Social media platforms amplify social proof manipulation through likes, shares, comments, and follower counts. These metrics create visible evidence of what other people approve of or pay attention to. Your brain interprets high engagement numbers as signs that content is valuable or worth your attention, regardless of its actual quality or relevance. Bystander effect is the dark side of social proof, where people fail to act in emergencies because they assume someone else will handle it. When everyone is looking to others for cues about appropriate behavior, sometimes no one acts at all. This demonstrates how social proof can lead to collective inaction as well as collective action. Social proof exploitation often involves timing and context manipulation. The same behavior might seem normal or abnormal depending on when and where it's presented. Someone might show you examples of people doing something at a specific time or place to make it seem more socially acceptable than it actually is in other contexts. The technique is particularly effective during times of uncertainty or stress. When you're unsure about what to do, you become more reliant on social cues from others. Manipulators often create artificial uncertainty or emphasize existing confusion to make you more susceptible to social proof influence. Authority figures can manufacture social proof by claiming that most people or everyone behaves in a certain way. These claims may be completely unsupported by actual data, but they still trigger your social proof instincts. Your brain responds to the suggestion of consensus, even when no real evidence is provided. Breaking free from social proof manipulation requires developing independent decision-making criteria. Before following what appears to be popular behavior, ask yourself whether you would make this choice if you knew nothing about what others were doing. Consider whether the people whose behavior you're following actually have relevant expertise or share your values and goals. The key to recognizing social proof exploitation is examining the source and authenticity of the behavioral evidence being presented. Are you seeing genuine, spontaneous behavior from people like you, or are you seeing curated examples designed to influence your behavior? Cognitive dissonance exploitation. Your brain has an overwhelming need for consistency between your beliefs, values, and actions. When these elements conflict with each other, it creates psychological discomfort called cognitive dissonance. This discomfort is so unpleasant that your mind will go to great lengths to resolve it, often by changing beliefs or rationalizing behavior rather than acknowledging contradictions. Cognitive dissonance exploitation works by deliberately creating conflicts between your beliefs and your actions, then providing convenient ways to resolve the discomfort. The manipulator guides you toward resolutions that serve their interests, rather than helping you maintain genuine consistency. The technique is particularly powerful because the discomfort of cognitive dissonance feels internal and personal. You experience it as your own psychological tension rather than external pressure. This makes you more likely to accept the manipulator's suggested resolution as your own idea rather than recognizing it as external influence. One common form involves getting you to take small actions that contradict your stated values or beliefs. Once you've acted inconsistently, your brain faces a choice: admit that you behaved hypocritically or adjust your beliefs to match your behavior. Most people choose to adjust their beliefs, which is exactly what the manipulator wants. Sunk cost fallacy is a form of cognitive dissonance where you continue investing in something because you've already invested so much. Admitting that your previous investments were mistakes creates dissonance between your self-image as a rational person and the reality of your poor decisions. Rather than face this discomfort, you continue investing. Post-purchase rationalization demonstrates how cognitive dissonance works in consumer behavior. After making a significant purchase, you experience dissonance if you encounter information suggesting you made a poor choice. To resolve this discomfort, your brain emphasizes the positive aspects of your purchase while downplaying or dismissing negative information. Manipulators exploit cognitive dissonance by creating situations where backing down or changing course would require you to admit error or inconsistency. They frame resistance to their requests as evidence that you're not living up to your own stated values. This puts you in a psychological bind where compliance feels like the only way to maintain self-respect. The technique also works through identity manipulation. If someone can get you to identify with a particular group or role, they can then use that identity to create dissonance when your behavior doesn't match group norms. You'll feel pressure to conform not because of external threats, but because of internal pressure to maintain consistent identity. Belief persistence is another manifestation of cognitive dissonance, where people maintain beliefs even after receiving contradictory evidence. Changing fundamental beliefs would create too much dissonance with existing worldviews, so the brain dismisses or reinterprets conflicting information instead. Group membership creates ongoing opportunities for cognitive dissonance exploitation. Once you identify with a group, disagreeing with group positions creates dissonance between your membership and your individual views. This pressure to maintain group harmony can lead you to suppress doubts or adopt positions you wouldn't otherwise hold. Breaking free from cognitive dissonance manipulation requires developing comfort with uncertainty and inconsistency. Accept that having conflicting thoughts and feelings is normal and doesn't necessarily require immediate resolution. Take time to examine whether your drive to resolve dissonance is leading you toward truth or simply toward psychological comfort. The key to recognizing cognitive dissonance exploitation is paying attention to internal pressure to maintain consistency. When you feel compelled to justify past actions or maintain positions primarily because changing them would be psychologically uncomfortable, you might be experiencing manufactured dissonance designed to control your behavior. Repetition. Hypnosis. Your conscious mind can only process a limited amount of information at any given time. When that capacity is overwhelmed through repetition or complexity, your brain shifts into a more passive, receptive state where critical thinking decreases and suggestions become more influential. This phenomenon can be exploited through repetition hypnosis techniques. Repetition hypnosis works by using monotonous, rhythmic, or overwhelming repetition to bypass critical thinking. The constant repetition fatigues your conscious analytical mind, making you more susceptible to embedded suggestions or commands. Your brain essentially gives up, trying to actively process each repetition, and shifts into a more automatic mode. The technique differs from obvious repetition because it's often disguised within seemingly normal conversation or presentation. Someone might repeat key phrases or concepts throughout a longer discussion, each repetition reinforcing the message while your conscious mind focuses on other aspects of the conversation. Rhythmic repetition is particularly effective because it can synchronize with your brain waves, creating a mild trance state. This is why repetitive music, chanting, or speaking patterns can feel hypnotic. Your brain starts to anticipate the rhythm, which reduces active processing and increases receptivity to suggestions. Mantras and affirmations work through similar mechanisms. The repetitive nature of these practices can induce altered states of consciousness, where suggestions become more deeply embedded. While this can be used positively for self-improvement, it can also be exploited by others who provide the repeated content. Information overload creates conditions similar to repetition hypnosis. When your brain is overwhelmed with too much information to process consciously, it becomes more susceptible to simple, repeated messages embedded within the complexity. The repetitive elements stand out and get processed, while other information gets filtered out. Commercial advertising heavily relies on repetition hypnosis through jingles, slogans, and repeated brand messages. The goal isn't to convince you consciously, but to embed brand associations so deeply that they influence behavior automatically. You might find yourself choosing familiar brands without consciously remembering why they seem familiar. Political messaging uses repetition hypnosis through campaign slogans, talking points, and repeated phrases. The constant repetition of simple messages can make them feel true and important, even when they lack substantive content. Your brain interprets the familiarity created by repetition as evidence of significance. Social media algorithms create repetition hypnosis by showing you similar content repeatedly. The same messages, viewpoints, or types of content appear in your feed multiple times in slightly different forms. This repetition can make minority viewpoints seem mainstream and fringe ideas seem normal. Cult indoctrination often involves repetition hypnosis through repeated phrases, songs, or concepts. The constant repetition wears down critical resistance while reinforcing group ideology. Members may find themselves thinking in the group's language and concepts even when not actively participating in group activities. Breaking free from repetition hypnosis requires recognizing when you're being exposed to excessive repetition and consciously re-engaging your analytical thinking. When you notice the same messages or phrases appearing repeatedly, take a step back and examine them critically rather than allowing them to bypass conscious evaluation. The key to recognizing repetition hypnosis is paying attention to your mental state during exposure to repeated information. If you find yourself feeling relaxed, less critical, or more accepting than usual, you might be experiencing the effects of repetition-induced altered consciousness. Priming. Your brain is constantly being influenced by subtle environmental cues that you're not consciously aware of. These cues can shape your thoughts, emotions, and behavior in ways that feel completely natural and self-generated. This phenomenon is called priming, and it can be deliberately manipulated to influence your decisions and actions. Priming works because your brain processes enormous amounts of sensory information below the threshold of conscious awareness. These unconscious inputs activate related concepts, memories, and behavioral patterns that then influence your conscious thinking and decision-making. The influence feels internal rather than external because you're not aware of the original trigger. Semantic priming involves exposure to words or concepts that activate related ideas in your mind. If someone mentions words related to elderly people during a conversation, you might unconsciously walk more slowly afterward. The connection between the words and the behavior happens automatically, without conscious recognition of the link. Visual priming uses images, colors, or symbols to influence psychological states. Red colors can increase urgency and appetite. Blue colors can enhance feelings of trust and calm. Someone might deliberately arrange their environment or clothing to trigger specific psychological responses in others. Situational priming involves creating environmental contexts that activate specific behavioral patterns. Meeting in a formal boardroom versus a casual cafe will prime different aspects of your personality and decision-making style. The location itself becomes a subtle influence on how you think and behave. Anchoring priming sets initial reference points that influence subsequent judgments. This differs from obvious anchoring because the reference point might be introduced through seemingly unrelated conversation or environmental cues, rather than direct numerical comparisons. Emotional priming involves subtle cues that activate specific emotional states. Certain music, lighting, or conversation topics can prime feelings of nostalgia, excitement, or anxiety. These emotional states then color your interpretation of subsequent information and influence your decision-making. Behavioral priming can influence your actions through exposure to concepts related to specific behaviors. Reading words related to cooperation makes people more likely to cooperate in subsequent interactions. Exposure to achievement-related concepts increases effort and persistence on tasks. Social priming activates stereotypes, social roles, or group identities that then influence behavior. Subtle reminders of your professional identity might make you more analytical and less emotional. References to family roles might make you more nurturing and protective. Cultural priming uses symbols, language, or concepts associated with specific cultural values to influence thinking patterns. References to individualism versus collectivism can shift decision-making styles. Historical or religious symbols can activate associated value systems. Temporal priming involves references to time periods that activate associated mindsets. Discussion of the past might make you more traditional in your thinking. Future-focused language might make you more innovative and risk-taking. Breaking free from priming manipulation requires developing awareness of environmental influences on your thinking. Pay attention to the context in which important decisions are being made. Consider whether subtle environmental factors might be influencing your judgment in ways that serve someone else's interests. The key to recognizing priming manipulation is noticing when your thoughts, emotions, or preferences seem to shift in ways that align suspiciously well with environmental cues or recent conversational topics. Take time to examine whether your reactions are genuinely your own or might be influenced by subtle contextual manipulation. Information overload. Your brain has limited capacity for processing information consciously. When this capacity is exceeded, your decision-making quality deteriorates, and you become more susceptible to manipulation. Information overload is deliberately created to overwhelm your analytical thinking and make you more likely to accept simplified solutions or defer to authority. Information overload works by presenting more data than you can reasonably evaluate within the available time frame. Faced with overwhelming complexity, your brain shifts from careful analysis to pattern recognition and emotional decision-making. You start looking for simple rules, familiar patterns, or trusted authorities to guide your choices. The technique exploits your brain's tendency to satisfy rather than optimize when overwhelmed. Instead of finding the best possible solution, you settle for the first solution that seems acceptable. This makes you vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who can position their preferred option as the most obvious or accessible choice. Decision paralysis often results from information overload. When faced with too many options or too much conflicting information, some people become unable to make any decision at all. This paralysis can be exploited by those who benefit from maintaining the status quo or who want to step in as decision makers. Selective presentation is a common form of information overload manipulation. Someone presents you with enormous amounts of information, but carefully controls which information you receive and in what order. The sheer volume makes you feel well-informed while actually limiting your perspective. Technical complexity can be used to create artificial information overload. By presenting information in unnecessarily complicated language or format, manipulators can make simple concepts seem overwhelmingly complex. This complexity makes you more likely to defer to their expertise rather than thinking through issues independently. Time pressure amplifies the effects of information overload. When you're given large amounts of information to process quickly, you're more likely to rely on mental shortcuts that can be exploited. The combination of information volume and time pressure creates ideal conditions for manipulation. Choice overload specifically involves presenting too many options to choose from. While having choices seems beneficial, too many options can actually decrease satisfaction and increase the likelihood of poor decisions. You might end up choosing randomly or avoiding the decision entirely. Financial products often use information overload through complex terms, conditions, and fee structures. The complexity makes it difficult to compare options or understand true costs. Customers often focus on the most prominently displayed features, while overlooking important details buried in the complexity. Legal documents frequently employ information overload through lengthy, complex language that few people read completely. The overwhelming nature of these documents makes people more likely to sign without full understanding, relying instead on assurances from interested parties. Academic or scientific language can create artificial information overload when used unnecessarily. By presenting simple concepts in complex terminology, someone can make their ideas seem more credible and authoritative, while actually obscuring meaning and preventing critical evaluation. Breaking free from information overload manipulation requires developing strategies for managing complex information. Set reasonable limits on how much information you'll consider for any decision. Focus on the most relevant factors rather than trying to process everything. Don't let complexity pressure you into quick decisions. The key to recognizing information overload manipulation is paying attention to whether the complexity serves your interests or someone else's. Ask yourself, is this information helping me make a better decision, or is it designed to overwhelm me into compliance? Legitimate complexity should enhance understanding, not obscure it. The Ben Franklin Effect. One of the most counterintuitive aspects of human psychology is that doing favors for someone actually makes you like them more, not less. This phenomenon is called the Ben Franklin Effect, named after the founding father who used it to win over a political rival. The effect can be exploited to manipulate your feelings and create artificial bonds of affection or loyalty. The Ben Franklin Effect works because of cognitive dissonance. When you do something nice for someone, your brain needs to explain why you took that action. The most psychologically comfortable explanation is that you must like the person, otherwise why would you help them? This post hoc rationalization creates genuine positive feelings that weren't there before. The effect is particularly powerful because it feels completely natural and self-generated. You don't realize that your positive feelings towards someone are the result of your own actions rather than their inherent qualities. The manipulation works by getting you to take actions that your brain then interprets as evidence of your own preferences. Small favors are often more effective than large ones for triggering this effect. A small favor doesn't feel significant enough to require external motivation, so your brain assumes internal motivation. Large favors might be attributed to social pressure, guilt, or other external factors rather than personal affection. The technique works by creating a cycle of escalating commitment. Once you've done one small favor and developed slightly positive feelings, you become more likely to do additional favors. Each favor reinforces the positive feelings and makes subsequent requests seem more reasonable. Investment of time and effort enhances the Ben Franklin effect. When you spend time helping someone or put effort into doing something for them, your brain interprets this investment as evidence that the person must be important to you. The more you invest, the more valuable they become in your mind. Personal favors are more effective than professional ones for creating emotional bonds. When someone asks for help with a personal problem rather than a work task, it feels more like a gesture of friendship. Your brain interprets the personal nature of the request as evidence of trust and intimacy. The effect also works with organizations and causes. When you volunteer for a charity or organization, you develop stronger positive feelings toward that group. Your brain assumes that you wouldn't donate your time unless you truly believed in the cause, creating deeper commitment than might have existed initially. Reciprocity confusion often accompanies the Ben Franklin effect. You might feel grateful towards someone for allowing you to help them, even though the logical direction of gratitude should be reversed. This confusion is part of what makes the effect so powerful and counterintuitive. Sunk cost psychology reinforces the Ben Franklin effect over time. As you accumulate more favors and investment in someone, it becomes psychologically costly to admit that your positive feelings were manufactured. Your brain prefers to maintain consistency by deepening the relationship rather than acknowledging manipulation. Public commitment amplifies the effect when your helping behavior is visible to others. When other people know you've helped someone, backing away from the relationship becomes socially awkward. The public nature of your assistance creates additional pressure to maintain positive feelings. Breaking free from Ben Franklin effect manipulation requires recognizing when your positive feelings towards someone are based more on your own actions than on their character or behavior. Before doing favors for people, especially new acquaintances, consider whether your helpful behavior might be creating artificial emotional bonds. The key to recognizing this manipulation is paying attention to the progression of your feelings towards someone. If your positive feelings seem to increase primarily after doing favors rather than after observing their positive qualities, you might be experiencing manufactured affection created by your own helpful behavior. The Pigrain Effect. The Pigrain Effect describes how incomplete or interrupted interactions create persistent psychological tension that keeps someone on your mind. When communication or interaction patterns are deliberately left unfinished, your brain continues processing the relationship even when the person isn't present. This effect works because your mind treats unresolved social interactions like unfinished tasks that require mental attention. The incomplete nature of the relationship creates psychological tension that your brain tries to resolve. This ongoing mental processing makes you think about the person more often and can increase emotional attachment. Intermittent reinforcement enhances the Pigrain effect by creating unpredictable patterns of attention and interaction. When someone sometimes responds enthusiastically and sometimes ignores you completely, the inconsistency creates more psychological engagement than steady, predictable interaction. Your brain becomes fixated on solving the puzzle of their behavior. The effect is particularly strong in the early stages of relationships, when patterns haven't been established. Uncertainty about someone's interest or availability creates mental preoccupation that can be mistaken for genuine romantic or social attraction. The psychological tension feels like chemistry, but it's actually manufactured uncertainty. Digital communication amplifies the Pigrain effect through read receipts, response delays, and partial messages. Seeing that someone has read your message but hasn't responded creates ongoing mental tension. Your brain keeps returning to the interaction, trying to understand what happened and what you should do next. Conversation cliffhangers deliberately exploit this effect by ending interactions at emotionally significant moments. Someone might reveal something important, then become unavailable, or ask a meaningful question, then disappear. The incomplete nature of these exchanges keeps you mentally engaged with the person. Hot and cold behavior patterns create sustained Pigrain effects by alternating between intense engagement and withdrawal. The person provides just enough positive interaction to maintain your interest, then withdraws enough to create uncertainty and psychological tension. This pattern can maintain mental preoccupation for extended periods. Social media platforms exploit the Pigrain effect through notification systems and intermittent engagement. The unpredictable nature of likes, comments, and messages creates ongoing psychological tension that keeps users mentally engaged with the platform, even when not actively using it. The effect becomes problematic when it's used to maintain psychological control over someone. By creating ongoing uncertainty and incompleteness, a manipulative person can occupy mental space and emotional energy that should be directed toward more healthy and productive activities. Trauma bonding often involves Pigrain effects, where abusive relationships create intense psychological preoccupation through cycles of harm and reconciliation. The incomplete resolution of conflicts and the unpredictable nature of treatment creates obsessive mental processing that can be mistaken for love or deep connection. Gaming addiction exploits similar mechanisms through intermittent rewards and unfinished objectives. The incomplete nature of game progress and unpredictable reward schedules create psychological tension that keeps players mentally engaged with the game, even when not playing. Breaking free from Pigrain effect manipulation requires recognizing when mental preoccupation with someone is based on uncertainty rather than genuine compatibility or positive qualities. Pay attention to whether your thoughts about someone increase during periods of withdrawal or uncertainty rather than during positive interactions. The key to recognizing this manipulation is examining the pattern of your mental engagement with someone. If you find yourself thinking about them most intensely when they're unavailable or confusing, rather than when they're present and positive, you might be experiencing manufactured psychological tension designed to maintain your attention. Negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is often misunderstood as punishment, but it's actually about removing something unpleasant to encourage behavior. When someone creates discomfort, then removes it in response to your compliance, they're using negative reinforcement to shape your actions. This technique can be particularly manipulative because the relief feels rewarding. The technique works by first establishing an unpleasant condition, then making the removal of that condition dependent on your behavior. The relief you feel when the unpleasant condition stops serves as a reward that makes you more likely to comply in similar situations. Your brain learns to associate compliance with relief from discomfort. Emotional withdrawal is a common form of negative reinforcement, where someone creates tension through coldness or disapproval, then returns to warmth when you behave as they want. The return to emotional connection feels rewarding because it removes the discomfort of rejection or disapproval. Silent treatment functions as negative reinforcement when communication resumes after compliance. The relief of restored communication serves as a reward that reinforces whatever behavior preceded the end of the silent treatment. Your brain learns that certain actions will restore the relationship. Nagging and persistent pressure create negative reinforcement situations where compliance provides relief from ongoing harassment. The manipulator doesn't stop bothering you until you agree to their demands. The peace that comes with giving in serves as the reward that reinforces compliance behavior. Guilt induction works through negative reinforcement when the guilt stops after you perform the desired behavior. Someone makes you feel guilty about something, then the guilt disappears when you comply with their wishes. The relief from guilt serves as reinforcement for the compliant behavior. Threat-based negative reinforcement involves creating fear or anxiety that only resolves when you comply. The manipulator establishes consequences you want to avoid, then removes the threat when you behave as they want. The relief from anxiety reinforces the desired behavior pattern. Financial pressure can function as negative reinforcement when compliance provides relief from money problems. Someone might create or maintain financial stress, then offer relief that's contingent on your behavior. The removal of financial pressure becomes a reward for compliance. Social pressure works through negative reinforcement when acceptance is conditional on behavior. The manipulator creates social discomfort through exclusion or criticism, then provides inclusion and approval when you conform. The relief from social rejection reinforces conformity. Time-based negative reinforcement involves creating ongoing inconvenience or delay that only resolves through compliance. The manipulator makes processes difficult or slow unless you behave as they want. The efficiency and ease that comes with compliance serves as the reinforcing reward. Chronic stress situations can involve negative reinforcement, where compliance provides temporary relief from ongoing pressure. The manipulator maintains high-stress conditions, then offers brief respites that are contingent on desired behavior. The relief becomes associated with compliance. Breaking free from negative reinforcement manipulation requires recognizing patterns where your compliance consistently removes discomfort that the same person created. Pay attention to situations where relief from problems coincides suspiciously with giving someone what they want. The key to recognizing negative reinforcement manipulation is examining whether the discomfort you're experiencing is natural and inevitable, or whether it's being created and controlled by someone who benefits from your compliance. Legitimate problems require genuine solutions, not behavioral compliance with specific individuals. False flattery. Compliments and praise trigger powerful psychological responses that can cloud judgment and create artificial bonds. False flattery exploits your natural desire for recognition and approval by providing excessive or manipulative praise designed to influence your behavior rather than genuinely recognize your qualities. False flattery works because your brain has difficulty distinguishing between genuine and manipulative praise. The positive feelings generated by compliments happen automatically, regardless of the giver's motivation. Even when you suspect flattery might be insincere, it still feels good and influences your perception of the flatterer. The technique is particularly effective because it targets your ego and self-esteem. When someone praises qualities you're proud of or insecure about, it creates a strong positive association with that person. Your brain starts to see them as someone who truly understands and appreciates you. Excessive praise often signals false flattery, especially when it comes early in a relationship or seems disproportionate to actual accomplishments. Manipulators use over-the-top compliments to overwhelm your critical thinking and create strong positive feelings quickly. Strategic timing makes false flattery more effective. Compliments delivered just before requests, during vulnerable moments, or when you're feeling insecure have greater psychological impact. The manipulator waits for optimal moments when you're most receptive to positive feedback. False flattery often focuses on qualities that are difficult to verify objectively. Instead of praising specific accomplishments, the flatterer might praise your intelligence, attractiveness, or unique insights. These subjective qualities are harder to evaluate critically, making the praise seem more credible. Comparative flattery positions you above others to create stronger psychological impact. The manipulator doesn't just praise you, they suggest you're better than other people. This technique appeals to your competitive instincts and makes you feel special and chosen. Insider flattery creates artificial intimacy by suggesting the flatterer sees qualities in you that others miss. They claim to recognize your hidden talents or understand aspects of your personality that others don't appreciate. This creates a feeling of special connection. False flattery often includes subtle criticism of others while praising you. The manipulator might criticize your friends, colleagues, or family members while emphasizing how much better you are. This technique isolates you from other relationships while strengthening dependence on the flatterer. Professional false flattery appears in work contexts where praise is used to extract additional effort without additional compensation. A manipulative manager might praise your dedication and unique abilities while assigning you extra work that benefits them more than you. Romantic false flattery involves excessive praise about physical appearance, personality, or compatibility that seems too intense for the level of actual relationship. The manipulator uses flattery to accelerate intimacy and create emotional dependency. Love bombing is an extreme form of false flattery, where someone overwhelms you with excessive attention, gifts, and praise early in a relationship. The intensity is designed to create strong attachment quickly, before you have time to evaluate the person's character objectively. Breaking free from false flattery manipulation requires developing a more objective perspective on compliments you receive. Pay attention to the context, timing, and motivation behind praise. Consider whether the compliments seem proportionate to your actual actions or relationship with the person. The key to recognizing false flattery is examining the pattern and purpose of compliments you receive. Genuine praise usually relates to specific actions or accomplishments and comes from people who know you well. False flattery often seems excessive, premature, or suspiciously aligned with the giver's interests. The contrast principle. Your brain doesn't evaluate things in isolation. Instead, it constantly makes comparisons to determine value, quality, and desirability. The contrast principle exploits this comparative thinking by manipulating the context in which you evaluate options, making certain choices seem more attractive than they actually are. The contrast principle works by strategically controlling what you compare new information against. When something is presented alongside inferior alternatives, it appears more valuable than it would if evaluated independently. Your brain focuses on the relative differences rather than absolute quality. Decoy effects use deliberate inferior options to make other choices seem more attractive. Someone might present 3 options where one is clearly worse than the others. The inferior option isn't meant to be chosen. It's there to make one of the other options seem like an obvious good deal by comparison. Price anchoring exploits contrast by establishing high reference points that make moderate prices seem reasonable. A restaurant might list an expensive wine first, making moderately priced wines seem affordable by comparison. The expensive option serves as a contrast anchor rather than a real choice. Sequential presentation manipulates contrast by controlling the order in which you encounter options. Car salespeople might show you basic models first, then present upgraded versions that seem luxurious by comparison. The same upgraded car would seem less impressive if shown alongside premium luxury vehicles. Temporal contrast involves comparing current situations to different time periods to influence perception. Someone might emphasize how much worse things used to be to make current conditions seem acceptable, or highlight potential future problems to make current offers seem urgent. Social contrast positions options relative to what other people supposedly have or do. A manipulator might suggest that you're getting a better deal than others, or that you're being offered something exclusive that most people can't access. The comparison to others' situations influences your evaluation. False scarcity often relies on contrast by comparing current availability to future scarcity. Someone might emphasize that prices will go up later, or that opportunities will become less available, making current offers seem better by comparison to imagined future conditions. Lifestyle contrast involves presenting options in contexts that highlight certain aspects while downplaying others. A product might be shown in an upscale environment to seem more luxurious, or a modest option might be presented alongside clearly inadequate alternatives. Feature contrast focuses attention on specific attributes by controlling what those attributes are compared against. A slow computer might be presented alongside even slower options to seem adequately fast, when the real comparison should be to computers with similar prices or intended uses. Emotional contrast manipulates your feelings about options by controlling the emotional context of comparison. Someone might create anxiety about one choice while emphasizing the security and comfort of their preferred alternative. The emotional contrast influences decision-making more than factual comparison. Problem amplification creates contrast by exaggerating current difficulties to make solutions seem more valuable. The manipulator emphasizes everything that's wrong with your current situation to make their alternative seem dramatically better by comparison. Breaking free from contrast manipulation requires developing independent evaluation criteria before encountering options. Decide what features, price ranges, or qualities actually matter to you, then evaluate options against those standards rather than against whatever comparisons are presented. The key to recognizing contrast principle manipulation is paying attention to what you're being asked to compare things against. Are the comparisons relevant and fair, or are they designed to make certain options seem better than they actually are? Take time to seek out additional context and alternative comparison points. Deliberate misinterpretation. Deliberate misinterpretation involves intentionally misunderstanding or misrepresenting your words, actions, or intentions to create confusion, defensiveness, or compliance. This manipulation technique can make you doubt your own communication skills and spend excessive energy clarifying positions rather than addressing substantive issues. Deliberate misinterpretation works by putting you in reactive positions where you're constantly explaining what you really meant, rather than pursuing your own agenda. The constant need to clarify and defend your communications gives the manipulator control over conversation direction and your mental energy. The technique also exploits your desire to be understood and to maintain good communication. When someone consistently misunderstands you, you might work harder to explain yourself clearly, giving them more information and attention than they deserve. Strawman interpretation involves misrepresenting your positions in ways that make them seem unreasonable or extreme. The manipulator takes your moderate statements and interprets them as radical positions, forcing you to defend against accusations that don't reflect your actual views. Selective hearing involves focusing only on certain parts of your communications while ignoring context or qualifying statements. The manipulator picks out phrases or words that can be interpreted negatively while ignoring explanatory information that would clarify your meaning. Emotional misreading involves interpreting your neutral or factual statements as emotionally charged attacks. The manipulator claims to feel hurt, offended, or attacked by communications that were intended as straightforward information sharing or reasonable requests. Intent distortion involves attributing malicious motivations to your benign actions or statements. The manipulator suggests that your helpful gestures were manipulative, your honest feedback was meant to cause harm, or your reasonable boundaries were intended as punishment. Context stripping involves taking your statements out of their original context and interpreting them in different situations where they would have different meanings. The manipulator removes situational information that would clarify your intended meaning. Precision manipulation involves demanding unrealistic levels of specificity in your communications, then misinterpreting any imprecision as evidence of confusion or deception. The manipulator creates impossible standards for clear communication, then uses failures to meet these standards against you. Literalism abuse involves interpreting obviously figurative or casual language as though it were meant literally. The manipulator ignores common sense context clues and social conventions to create artificial misunderstandings. Question distortion involves misrepresenting your questions as statements or accusations. When you ask for clarification or information, the manipulator interprets these questions as challenges to their authority or competence. Timing misinterpretation involves claiming that the timing of your communications reveals hidden meanings or motivations. The manipulator suggests that when you choose to say something is as important as what you say, creating additional layers of potential misunderstanding. Historical revision involves misremembering or misrepresenting past conversations to support current misinterpretations. The manipulator claims you said things you didn't say or meant things you didn't mean, using false history to justify current confusion. Projection misinterpretation involves attributing their own thoughts, feelings, or motivations to you. The manipulator assumes you think or feel the way they do, then interprets your communications through that distorted lens. Breaking free from deliberate misinterpretation requires recognizing when communication problems seem consistently one-sided, and when misunderstandings always seem to benefit the other person. Stop over-explaining yourself when someone repeatedly misinterprets clear communications. The key to recognizing deliberate misinterpretation is paying attention to patterns of misunderstanding and whether they serve the misinterpreter's interests. If someone consistently misunderstands you in ways that give them advantages or put you at disadvantages, the misinterpretation might be intentional rather than accidental. Forced commitment. Forced commitment involves creating situations where you feel pressured to make binding promises or agreements without adequate time for consideration. The manipulator uses various psychological pressures to extract commitments that serve their interests, while making it difficult for you to back out later. Forced commitment works by exploiting your brain's consistency, drive, and social accountability mechanisms. Once you've made a commitment, especially a public one, your mind creates psychological pressure to follow through even when circumstances change or you realize the commitment wasn't wise. The technique often combines multiple manipulation methods such as time pressure, social pressure, and authority pressure to overwhelm your decision-making capacity. Under this pressure, you agree to commitments you would reject if given adequate time and space to consider them properly. Artificial deadline creation involves imposing unrealistic time limits on important decisions to prevent careful consideration. The manipulator claims that opportunities will disappear or that delays will have negative consequences, creating urgency around immediate commitment. Public pressure commitment involves making requests in social settings, where refusing would seem inappropriate or embarrassing. The social context creates additional pressure to agree because backing out would require disappointing or disagreeing with multiple people simultaneously. Authority pressure involves using power dynamics or expertise claims to make refusal seem insubordinate or foolish. Someone in a position of authority suggests that smart or loyal people would naturally commit to their proposal, creating professional or social pressure to comply. Emotional manipulation commitment involves using your feelings of guilt, sympathy, or obligation to extract promises. The manipulator creates emotional states where refusing to commit feels heartless or selfish, even when the commitment isn't in your best interest. Reciprocity pressure involves referencing past favors or future benefits to create feelings of obligation around commitment. The manipulator suggests that fair people would commit in return for what they've received or will receive. Identity pressure involves connecting potential commitments to your self-concept or values. The manipulator suggests that people like you, or people with your values, would naturally want to make these commitments, creating psychological pressure to maintain consistent identity. Group pressure involves emphasizing that others have already committed or are expecting your commitment. The manipulator creates social momentum that makes refusing to commit seem like letting the group down or being the only holdout. Incremental commitment involves getting small initial agreements that make larger commitments seem like natural progressions. Each small commitment creates psychological foundation for larger requests that build on established patterns of compliance. Fear-based commitment involves emphasizing negative consequences of not committing while downplaying the risks of commitment itself. The manipulator creates scenarios where commitment seems like the safer choice compared to uncertain alternatives. Gratitude exploitation involves timing commitment requests with moments when you feel grateful or appreciative. The positive emotions created by gratitude make you more likely to agree to commitments as expressions of appreciation. Confusion commitment involves making requests during times when you're overwhelmed, distracted, or unable to process information clearly. The manipulator takes advantage of compromised decision-making capacity to extract agreements you might not make under normal circumstances. Breaking free from forced commitment manipulation requires recognizing when decision-making conditions are suboptimal and insisting on adequate time and space for consideration. Legitimate commitments should survive careful thought and shouldn't require high-pressure decision-making environments. The key to recognizing forced commitment manipulation is paying attention to the context and pressure surrounding commitment requests. If someone seems urgently invested in getting your immediate agreement rather than helping you make good long-term decisions, their interests might not align with yours. Guilt seeding. Guilt seeding is a subtle manipulation technique that involves planting feelings of guilt or responsibility before making requests or creating expectations. Instead of using obvious guilt trips, the manipulator creates psychological conditions where you feel guilty for not complying with their wishes, even when those wishes are unreasonable. Guilt seeding works by establishing emotional foundations that make resistance feel morally wrong or selfish. The manipulator carefully cultivates your sense of obligation, responsibility, or debt before revealing what they actually want from you. By the time the request comes, you already feel guilty about the possibility of saying no. The technique is particularly insidious because the guilt feels self-generated rather than externally imposed. You experience internal moral pressure to comply rather than external coercion, which makes the manipulation harder to recognize and resist. Preemptive obligation creation involves establishing reasons why you should feel responsible for the manipulator's well-being before they need anything from you. They might emphasize their past help, current struggles, or your comparative advantages to create guilt about having more while they have less. Historical guilt cultivation involves repeatedly referencing past events where they helped you, made sacrifices for you, or suffered in ways connected to you. These historical references create accumulated guilt that can be activated when they need compliance or assistance. Comparative suffering emphasis involves highlighting their difficulties in contrast to your advantages to create guilt about inequality. They might emphasize how easy your life is compared to theirs, how lucky you are compared to them, or how much you have compared to their struggles. Future consequence seeding involves suggesting that your potential refusal to help will lead to serious negative outcomes for them. They establish scenarios where saying no would cause significant harm, making refusal feel like moral abandonment. Identity guilt creation involves connecting potential non-compliance to negative character traits. They might suggest that people who care about others, family members who love each other, or friends who are truly loyal, would naturally want to help in their situation. Sacrifice narrative building involves emphasizing everything they've given up or endured for your benefit to create guilt about not reciprocating. The narrative positions them as selfless givers, and you as the beneficiary who owes ongoing gratitude and support. Vulnerability amplification involves emphasizing their emotional or physical fragility to create guilt about potentially causing them additional stress or harm through non-compliance. Your refusal becomes positioned as kicking someone while they're down. Social responsibility seeding involves creating guilt about broader social obligations or group expectations. They might suggest that good community members, responsible adults, or caring people in your position would naturally want to help in their situation. Missed opportunity guilt involves suggesting that failing to help now will result in regret later when it's too late. They create scenarios where your future self will feel guilty about not taking action when you had the chance to make a difference. Time pressure guilt adds urgency to the seeded guilt by suggesting that delay equals denial and that thinking it over shows lack of care. The time pressure prevents you from processing the manipulation and increases the feeling that immediate compliance is the only moral choice. Gratitude, expectation seeding involves establishing that they don't want to have to ask for help and hope that you'll offer assistance voluntarily. This creates guilt about making them explicitly request what they need, rather than anticipating their needs and offering help proactively. Breaking free from guilt seeding requires recognizing when feelings of guilt seem disproportionate to actual moral obligations. Pay attention to whether your guilt feelings are based on genuine wrongdoing or on manufactured emotional pressure designed to control your behavior. The key to recognizing guilt seeding is examining the timing and context of guilt feelings. If you consistently feel guilty about not helping someone, especially before they've made specific requests, you might be experiencing deliberately cultivated emotional pressure rather than natural moral response. Planned vulnerability. Strategic displays of weakness or vulnerability can be one of the most powerful manipulation techniques because they trigger your natural protective and nurturing instincts. Planned vulnerability involves deliberately showing carefully controlled weaknesses to create emotional bonds, reduce your defenses, and gain your trust and sympathy. Planned vulnerability works because humans are evolutionarily programmed to help those who seem vulnerable or in need. When someone appears fragile, struggling, or emotionally wounded, your brain automatically shifts into caretaking mode. This response happens before your rational mind can evaluate whether the vulnerability is genuine or manufactured. The technique is particularly effective because it creates the illusion of intimacy and trust. When someone shares apparent weaknesses or struggles with you, it feels like they're being authentic and transparent. Your brain interprets these disclosures as signs of special connection and trustworthiness. Strategic emotional disclosure involves sharing personal struggles, past traumas, or current difficulties in calculated ways to create sympathy and reduce scrutiny. The manipulator carefully selects which vulnerabilities to reveal and when to reveal them for maximum emotional impact. Selective weakness display involves showing vulnerability in areas that make you want to help, while hiding strengths that might make you cautious. Someone might emphasize their emotional struggles while concealing their manipulative skills, or highlight financial difficulties while hiding other resources. Timing manipulation coordinates vulnerable displays with moments when you're most likely to respond with care and protection. The manipulator might reveal struggles during times when you're feeling strong and capable, or when you've recently experienced similar difficulties yourself. Incremental vulnerability involves gradually revealing deeper levels of apparent weakness to create escalating emotional investment. Each disclosure makes you feel more trusted and connected, increasing your willingness to provide help and support. False fragility involves exaggerating or fabricating emotional sensitivity to control how others interact with you. Someone might claim to be easily hurt or overwhelmed to prevent confrontation and criticism while maintaining behavioral control through others' fear of causing emotional damage. Rescue fantasy exploitation takes advantage of your desire to be helpful and important to someone who seems to need you. The manipulator positions themselves as someone who can be saved or fixed through your care and attention, making you feel special and needed. Past trauma weaponization involves using real or fabricated history of abuse, neglect, or suffering to explain current problematic behavior and prevent accountability. The trauma narrative creates sympathy while excusing manipulative or harmful actions. Comparative vulnerability involves emphasizing how much worse their situation is compared to others to increase sympathy and reduce expectations. This positioning makes their struggles seem more significant, and your potential complaints seem petty by comparison. Health vulnerability manipulation uses real or exaggerated physical or mental health issues to create protective instincts and reduce demands. The health concerns become shields against criticism and tools for gaining special treatment and accommodation. Financial vulnerability displays involve emphasizing money problems to gain assistance while potentially hiding other resources or spending patterns. The financial struggles create urgency around helping while preventing close examination of actual circumstances. Emotional overwhelm performance involves appearing unable to handle normal life stresses or responsibilities, creating pressure for others to step in and provide support. This learned helplessness can become a form of control through others' caretaking impulses. Breaking free from planned vulnerability manipulation requires distinguishing between genuine need and strategic weakness display. Pay attention to whether someone's vulnerabilities seem to appear at convenient times or to consistently result in benefits for them. The key to recognizing planned vulnerability is examining patterns of weakness display and their outcomes. If someone's vulnerabilities consistently lead to them getting what they want while avoiding accountability or reciprocal care, the vulnerability might be more strategic than genuine. False consensus effect. The false consensus effect involves creating artificial impressions that most people share certain opinions, values, or behaviors when this consensus doesn't actually exist. This manipulation exploits your natural tendency to feel more comfortable and confident when your choices align with what appears to be the majority position. False consensus manipulation works because humans use perceived social agreement as a shortcut for determining what's normal, acceptable, or correct. When you believe that most people think or act in certain ways, you're more likely to adopt similar positions to avoid social isolation or to gain social acceptance. The technique is particularly powerful because it can shift your perception of social reality without requiring proof of actual consensus. Simply claiming that most people agree with something can be enough to influence behavior, especially when you don't have easy access to verify the claims. Manufactured majority opinion involves claiming widespread support for positions that may actually be minority viewpoints. The manipulator presents their preferred views as obviously mainstream, while positioning alternative viewpoints as fringe or unusual. Selective polling manipulation involves conducting or reporting surveys in ways that create false impressions of consensus. This might involve asking leading questions, polling biased samples, or misrepresenting results to suggest broader agreement than actually exists. Echo chamber amplification involves surrounding you with people who share the manipulator's viewpoints to create impressions of universal agreement. By limiting your exposure to diverse perspectives, they make their positions seem like common sense rather than contested opinions. Expert consensus claims involve suggesting that professionals, authorities, or knowledgeable people all agree on certain positions when this professional consensus may not exist. The manipulator leverages respect for expertise to add credibility to their consensus claims. Cultural norm manipulation involves presenting certain behaviors or attitudes as culturally expected or socially required when they may actually be preferences rather than norms. This creates pressure to conform with artificially established social expectations. Historical inevitability framing suggests that current trends represent natural social evolution that everyone recognizes and accepts. The manipulator positions their preferred changes as obvious next steps that all reasonable people support. Demographic consensus involves claiming that people like you typically think or behave in certain ways. This creates pressure to conform with your perceived identity group, while potentially misrepresenting what that group actually believes or does. Moral consensus manipulation involves claiming that ethical people naturally support certain positions, creating pressure to conform with implied moral standards. The manipulator suggests that disagreement indicates moral deficiency rather than legitimate difference of opinion. Generational consensus involves claiming that people of your age group or generation share certain values or preferences. This creates pressure to conform with age-based identity while potentially misrepresenting generational diversity. Academic consensus manipulation involves claiming that educated or intelligent people naturally reach certain conclusions. This creates intellectual pressure to conform while potentially misrepresenting the actual range of educated opinion on complex issues. Professional consensus involves claiming that people in your field or industry all recognize certain realities or support certain approaches. This creates career-based pressure to conform with allegedly established professional standards. Breaking free from false consensus manipulation requires actively seeking diverse perspectives and questioning claims about what most people think or do. Before accepting consensus claims, look for actual evidence of widespread agreement from credible, unbiased sources. The key to recognizing false consensus manipulation is paying attention to how claims about majority opinion are supported and whether you have independent access to verify these claims. Be especially skeptical when consensus claims perfectly align with someone's interests or when they discourage you from seeking alternative perspectives. Confession triggers. Confession triggers are psychological techniques designed to get you to reveal personal information, secrets, or vulnerabilities that can later be used for manipulation or control. These techniques exploit your natural tendencies toward reciprocity, trust building, and emotional release to extract information you might not otherwise share. Confession triggers work by creating psychological conditions that make self-disclosure feel natural, safe, or necessary. Once you've shared personal information, the manipulator has additional leverage for future influence and a deeper understanding of your psychological vulnerabilities. The technique is particularly dangerous because it can feel therapeutic or bonding to share personal information. The temporary relief of disclosure can mask the long-term risks of having given someone power over you through knowledge of your private matters. Reciprocal disclosure involves the manipulator sharing carefully selected personal information to create pressure for you to reciprocate. They might reveal struggles, secrets, or vulnerabilities that seem intimate, but are actually calculated to trigger your own disclosures. Therapeutic mimicry involves creating environments that feel like counseling or therapy sessions where deep personal sharing seems appropriate. The manipulator asks probing questions, and provides supportive responses that encourage increasingly personal revelations. Alcohol and relaxation facilitation involves creating contexts where your inhibitions are lowered and personal disclosure feels more natural. This might include social drinking, late-night conversations, or other situations where your normal privacy boundaries are reduced. Crisis exploitation involves using your moments of emotional distress, confusion, or vulnerability to extract personal information. When you're overwhelmed or upset, you might share information you would normally keep private. Guilt-based extraction involves suggesting that withholding personal information indicates lack of trust or care for the relationship. The manipulator makes you feel guilty for maintaining normal privacy boundaries. Authority-based disclosure involves using professional or expertise claims to justify requests for personal information. The manipulator suggests that their ability to help you depends on knowing intimate details about your life or psychology. Comparison pressure involves sharing how open other people have been to create pressure for you to match their level of disclosure. The manipulator suggests that your privacy indicates you're less trusting or committed than others. Future security promises involve guaranteeing that shared information will be kept confidential or used only for your benefit. These promises create false security around disclosure, while the manipulator has no intention of honoring confidentiality agreements. Incremental extraction involves gradually increasing the intimacy level of questions or conversations. Each small disclosure makes slightly more personal questions seem reasonable, creating a progression toward major revelations. Problem-solving pretense involves claiming to need personal information to help solve your problems or improve your situation. The manipulator positions intimate questions as necessary for providing assistance rather than satisfying curiosity or gaining control. Emergency disclosure involves creating or emphasizing crisis situations where sharing personal information seems necessary for safety or well-being. The manufactured urgency overrides normal privacy considerations. Relationship-building justification involves suggesting that sharing personal information is necessary for deepening friendship, romance, or professional relationships. The manipulator makes disclosure seem like a relationship requirement rather than a personal choice. Breaking free from confession, trigger manipulation, requires maintaining awareness of your disclosure, comfort levels, and questioning why someone needs specific personal information. Legitimate helpers can usually provide assistance without requiring intimate details about your private life. The key to recognizing confession trigger manipulation is paying attention to pressure around personal disclosure and examining whether requests for personal information serve your interests or someone else's. Be especially cautious when disclosure requests come with emotional pressure or urgency that doesn't match the actual situation. False equivalence. False equivalence is a manipulation technique that presents two fundamentally different things as essentially the same to distort your perception of situations, choices, or moral judgments. This technique can make reasonable options seem extreme, or make extreme options seem reasonable by creating inappropriate comparisons. False equivalence works by exploiting your brain's tendency to seek balance and fairness in evaluating different positions. When someone presents two options as equivalent, your mind naturally tries to find middle ground or treat them with equal consideration, even when they don't deserve equal weight. The technique is particularly dangerous because it can normalize extreme positions by pairing them with mainstream views and suggesting they deserve equal consideration. It can also make reasonable positions seem extreme by pairing them with genuinely extreme alternatives. Moral false equivalence involves comparing actions or positions that have vastly different moral implications, as though they were equivalent ethical choices. Someone might compare minor rule-breaking with serious ethical violations to minimize the severity of major wrongdoing. Scale false equivalence involves comparing issues of vastly different magnitude, as though they were equally important. Minor inconveniences might be presented as equivalent to major hardships, to create disproportionate responses or to minimize serious problems. Motivation false equivalence involves comparing actions that have different underlying intentions as though the motivations were equivalent. Someone might compare accidental harm with deliberate cruelty to deflect responsibility or minimize intentional wrongdoing. Context false equivalence involves comparing situations that occur in completely different contexts, as though the contextual differences don't matter. Actions that are appropriate in one setting might be presented as equivalent to inappropriate actions in different settings. Consequence false equivalence involves comparing choices that have vastly different potential outcomes, as though they were equally risky or beneficial. Minor risks might be presented as equivalent to major dangers to prevent reasonable precautions. Historical false equivalence involves comparing current situations to historical events that have fundamentally different characteristics. This can normalize current problems by comparing them to worse historical situations, or minimize current advantages by comparing them to better historical periods. Authority false equivalence involves presenting experts and non-experts as having equivalent credibility on technical subjects. Someone with no relevant expertise might be presented as equally qualified to comment on complex issues as genuine specialists. Source false equivalence involves presenting reliable and unreliable information sources as equivalent in credibility. Established institutions might be compared to fringe sources to create false impressions of equal validity. Effort false equivalence involves comparing actions that require vastly different levels of commitment or sacrifice as though they were equivalent contributions. Small gestures might be presented as equivalent to major commitments to avoid accountability for limited participation. Risk false equivalence involves comparing low probability risks with high probability risks as though they were equally likely or concerning. This can either create unnecessary anxiety about unlikely events or minimize concern about likely problems. Impact false equivalence involves comparing actions that affect different numbers of people or have different severity of effects as though they were equally significant. Personal preferences might be presented as equivalent to matters affecting many people's well-being. Temporal false equivalence involves comparing past and present situations without acknowledging how circumstances have changed. What was appropriate or necessary in different time periods might be presented as equivalent to current situations with different constraints. Breaking free from false equivalence manipulation requires examining whether things being compared actually have equivalent significance, impact, or moral weight. Before accepting comparisons, consider whether the compared items truly deserve equal consideration or treatment. The key to recognizing false equivalence manipulation is paying attention to comparisons that seem designed to normalize extreme positions or minimize significant differences. Question whether items being presented as equivalent actually share the same characteristics, consequences, or moral implications that would justify treating them equally. The Decoy Effect. The decoy effect manipulates your decision-making by introducing inferior options that make other choices seem more attractive by comparison. This technique doesn't aim to sell you the decoy option itself, but rather to influence your preference between the remaining alternatives. The decoy effect works because your brain relies heavily on comparative evaluation when making choices. Instead of evaluating options independently, you tend to focus on relative differences between available alternatives. A strategically placed inferior option can shift these comparisons in predictable ways. The technique exploits a quirk in human psychology, where adding an obviously worse option can actually increase preference for one of the better options, even though the addition of more choices should theoretically make decision-making more difficult. Asymmetric dominance involves creating decoy options that are clearly inferior to one target option, but only slightly inferior to another. This makes the superior target option seem like an obvious choice compared to both the decoy and the alternative option. Price anchoring decoys involve introducing expensive options that make moderately priced alternatives seem reasonable. The expensive option isn't meant to sell. It's meant to make other prices seem like good deals by comparison. Feature manipulation involves creating options with different combinations of features to guide preference towards specific choices. The decoy might have fewer features than the target option, but similar features to the alternative, making the target seem superior. Quality positioning uses decoys to influence perception of quality levels. A low-quality decoy makes moderate quality seem acceptable, while a moderate quality decoy makes high quality seem worth the additional cost. Subscription tier manipulation involves creating pricing structures with deliberately unattractive middle options that guide consumers toward premium choices. The middle tier makes the premium option seem like better value compared to choosing the basic option. Menu engineering uses decoy items to influence restaurant choices. Expensive dishes make other items seem reasonably priced, while strategically placed unappealing options guide customers toward preferred menu items. Real estate showing strategies involve showing overpriced or problematic properties before showing the target property. The inferior options make the intended choice seem like a better deal and help justify higher prices. Service package decoys involve creating inferior service tiers that make premium packages seem necessary or reasonable. The basic option includes so few features that upgrading feels essential rather than optional. Investment option manipulation involves presenting clearly poor investment choices alongside target investments to make the target option seem safer or more profitable by comparison. Employment package decoys involve structuring compensation packages with alternatives that seem inferior to guide job candidates toward accepting specific offers. The decoy packages make the intended offer seem more generous. Technology product positioning uses feature combinations and pricing to guide consumers toward specific products. Lower-end models lack important features, while higher-end models include unnecessary extras, making the target model seem perfectly balanced. Breaking free from decoy effect manipulation requires recognizing when you're being presented with options that seem designed to guide your choice rather than provide genuine alternatives. Before making decisions, consider whether the available options represent the full range of possibilities. The key to recognizing decoy effect manipulation is paying attention to whether the available choices seem to include obviously inferior options that nobody would reasonably select. These may be present specifically to influence your evaluation of the remaining alternatives rather than to provide genuine choice.